So my name is Zachary Patterson. I'm a professor in the Department of Urban Planning at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I'm going to talk to you today about dynamic mapping using smartphones in the context of transit planning in Accra, in Ghana. And so this is a project. Actually, well, there's a number of different players who are a part of this. There's the Accra Municipal Assembly, the French Development Agency, my university, and GAPT, which is the regional kind of planner in. So the Accra Municipal Assembly is the municipality, the central part of Accra, and then GAPT is the assembly of all the different assemblies that are in Ghana. In addition to being a professor in the department, I'm director of the TRIP Lab, the Transport Research for Integrated Planning Lab. And we do a number of different things, but one area that's very core to what we're doing nowadays is the collection of data through emerging technologies, primarily smartphones, but not exclusively. Sometimes smartphones as the instrument to collect the information, sometimes collecting information that's passively collected, like from wireless access logs. As I think I'm sure this audience knows this. Basically, there's been a huge revolution in our ability to be able to collect information as a result of GPS, GSM, Wi-Fi on the network side, and then also the phones themselves to be able to transmit, communicate with these different networks. And most importantly, in the context of what I'm going to talk about today is the transfer of locational information from the cell phone. So the cell phone knows where it is, and it can tell other people through the internet and through communications on the internet where they are as well. It's what we use in this project. So for those of you who are familiar with Ghana or Accra, Accra is the capital city of Ghana in Africa, and here we have it up on the map. So Accra, I think strictly speaking, isn't a secondary city because it's a capital city, but somehow we were able to sneak into this conference all the same. But it's certainly a rapidly growing, developing world city, and it has lots of different challenges. How did we get involved in this project? One of my former students works for the French Development Agency. He was posted in Accra, responsible for infrastructure. One of the types of infrastructure he was responsible for was transportation. And he was working with the Accra Municipal Assembly. And it turns out that in Accra, as is the case in many of these secondary cities, there are informal or semi-formal public transit systems. Often they're operated like these, in Accra they're called Trotros, or they've got different names in different places. But often they're former commercial vans from other parts of the world that end up in these cities, and they're used to carry passengers around. They can be more or less formal. In the case of Accra, they describe it as semi-formal because there is some regulation for them. And in fact, since 2008, the Accra Municipal Assembly has registered routes. So they come up with a system of routes. They register the drivers and the vehicles, and they set harmonized fares. These routes themselves are run by operator unions. The unions themselves organize the operation of dedicated terminals. So when we say that the routes are registered, what's registered is actually the origin and destination terminuses. And these terminuses are operated by, or the terminals are operated by the operator unions, and they organize the delivery of the services of the Trotros between these different terminals, and they negotiate the fares with the Accra Municipal Assembly. So at the beginning of the project, and the reason I got involved, my former student was working there. He'd been working with the Accra Municipal Assembly, and here was the problem. They had a list of routes. The Accra Municipal Assembly had a list of the routes that they believed were being operated, that they'd licensed or that they'd registered. They had the origin and the destination terminuses. That was kind of the definition of what the route was. And they had the regulated fares, but they didn't actually know of the routes that were registered, how many of them were in service. They didn't know what the actual routes were that were being followed, the itineraries. They didn't know where they stopped. They didn't know how much people were being charged to ride the Trotros, and as a result, they wanted to try to get a handle on that. So that's the first part of this project. The talk is mostly about applications of this dynamic mapping that have been done in the context of this question of Trotros and the Trotro network. So there's two phases of the project. The first one is finished, the second one's ongoing. In the first phase of the project, we wanted to do, or the Accra Municipal Assembly wanted to do an audit of the existing routes. They wanted to map the itineraries. They wanted to know where the buses were actually going, where the Trotros were actually going. And they wanted to have information about the stops. Where were the stops? Where were people getting on and off? How many people were getting on and off? And they also, related to the stop data, is this question of fares. So the way we went about doing this was by using two different free apps. One of them is called DataMobile, and it's an app that we developed in our lab. It's called the DataMobile Travel Survey app, and it's designed for a slightly different context. Often, what happens in the US, North America, Canada, every few years, the municipal, regional transit planning authorities would like to have a sense of overall transportation demand and behavior within a region. And so they have origin destination surveys. They're done a little bit differently from one place to another, but one thing that they commonly have, or characteristic that they have in common commonly, is they'll call people up at home and they'll say, okay, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? How old are you? Are you a male or a female? What kind of job do you do? And tell me about the trips that you made yesterday. And you'd say, oh, I went to work. And they'd say, oh, you went to work. Okay, that's great. How did you get there? And you'd say, by transit. And then they would say, well, what routes did you take? And then they'd ask you information about everyone else in your household. That's the old-fashioned way. It's the most common way that it's still done, but there are lots of problems with that, as you might be able to imagine, especially in a university setting. A lot of young people don't have fixed telephones anymore. So we developed this app because we wanted to see what's the potential of using these kinds of apps to help produce information about people who aren't appearing in these traditional surveys. So the survey itself, or the app existed, and then we have, you ask very similar types of questions, and then it logs the location of people throughout the day, so you can get a sense of where they've been traveling. And you can ask them questions every time they stop. Why did you come here? What were you doing it for? Associated with the app itself is a kind of visualization and a data collection interface platform. And this is what it looks like, and this is actually a few of the routes that would have been mapped in Accra. So this is Accra, and it's important because we used this infrastructure when mapping it and mapping the Trotro system in conjunction with the planners at the Accra Municipal Assembly. The other application that we used was an application called TapLog. TapLog is another free smartphone application, and I don't know, I just found it on the internet, and it did the job. It's a personal event logger, so it logs events, it takes information, and it also, not information that you want to put in, as well as locational information. So this was used for collecting information on the stops. So we used DataMobile to collect route itineraries, and that allowed us obviously to map out the routes and get a sense of the distances and the travel times. We also used TapLog. TapLog was used to collect stop location information as well as the name, how many people got on and off, and the fares that were associated with the different routes. The project flow was like this. So here's at the bottom of the picture, this is for phase one, it was the collection team, the surveyors, who had the smartphones. So we provided the smartphones, actually. They were kind of entry-level Android smartphones, $65 US. There were 10 or 12 of them. And we provided them to the Accra Municipal Assembly. And here are the surveyors. This is at the beginning when they were starting to do the data collection. And so what happened was it started off with the Accra Municipal Assembly. They had these things that they need to know, how many of our routes are operating, where are they going, how much do they cost. And we put together a data collection, dispatching 11. Okay, there's one little spot. there's a data collection protocol that we drafted together, and then once the data collection protocol had gone back and forth between us, we started collecting data with the surveyors. At the end of every day, information was sent up to our servers automatically. There's also, and we did some automatic processing on our side to begin to do the majority of the mapping. We had to, there's a whole series of different processing steps that take place before we could actually finalize the routes. But in addition to having the processing of the original data that came up, there was visual verification of the collected data. So on the people who were responsible at the Accra Municipal Assembly would look at the web interface and make sure that the data had been collected for the different routes over the course of the day. And then once that had been, once we'd processed the data, once that they'd taken a look at it, then we would map it on our side. We would do the last steps of the actual route mapping. And then in the end, if there were any routes that were missing, if there was any data that was missing from particular routes, then they'd go back and do the data collection for routes again. So that's the dynamic mapping. The mapping was done not exactly in real time, but not far from real time. The time between when the surveyors were actually on the road and when it appeared as a shapefile, it was a day or so. And so once that had been done, then we could start doing some findings, or presenting findings that came out in a paper in the Transportation Research Record. And as it turns out, they had registered, the Accra Municipal Assembly had 580 routes that were registered, but there were only 315 routes that were actually in service and that we mapped. The reason for this is a couple of reasons. Sometimes there were just mistakes in the database that they had, and sometimes they're inactive or ghost routes. Companies, operators, unions would register a route because there's also pricing issues. It didn't cost anything. And so basically you'd register a route and you might not operate it because you thought that it doesn't make sense to run it right now, but in a year or two or in 5 or 6 months, it might be worth running. So that was the big, kind of the first exciting finding. Then we mapped the route system, and as you can see, it's relatively complex. I've just zoomed in a little bit more here in the downtown part. There are many different routes running parallel in different, all over the city. So this first kind of map was useful. These first set of results were useful from a planning perspective. From a very broad perspective, here you can take a look and you get a sense of what areas are well served or what areas might be underserved. There's a couple of areas that are underserved. Sort of towards the east, an area called the cantonments. That's a little bit less of a problem. It's a relatively wealthy area where a lot of people travel by car, but in the bottom sort of southeast, there's an empty spot. I don't really have a zoom, but in here, it's not paved roads, but it's an area that could probably use better transit accessibility. But at the moment, because the roads aren't paved, the Trotros don't like to go there. So these are the kinds of things from a planning perspective that are useful for the Accra Municipal Assembly, as well as a sense of where the stops are, where are people actually stopping. There's obvious locations at terminuses where people are getting on and off, and you can see that there's kind of a smattering of stops around these terminuses. These terminuses are typically pretty big, but as well as along these main corridors and the main arteries. We're also able to pull out information like how long it takes to get to do the route at different times of the day. So we had an inbound and an outbound trip. And you can see that the speeds vary enormously. So sometimes there's very bad congestion in Accra. So you can get 4 kilometers an hour. That's 3 miles, 2.5 miles an hour, or something like that on average. That's obviously that's the minimum. But there's a fair bit of these are the kinds of it's the type of information that we can get out, and that is interesting for the planners themselves. Where are the areas where investments might be useful, for example, and also they can keep track of whether or not the operators are adhering to the agreed to fares. The second part of the project, and this is a project that we're kind of halfway through, or maybe a bit more than that, we're almost done, but we haven't We haven't got all of our results yet. What happened, so after we released the map, with the mayor was there, and it was all very exciting. They realized a number of things. One of which, that map that I showed you was actually quite, I mean, it's geographically faithful, but very detailed, difficult for regular people to interpret or to understand. So one of the aspects of the second phase was to try to make the Trotro route data more accessible, and there's two ways in which that was done. One was conversion to GTFS. I'll talk to you about what that is in a second, which you may or may not be familiar with. And the second was to make a user-friendly map, something that riders might be able to interpret more easily, as well as in-depth knowledge of the routes and operations, and in particular, how much do the routes vary, and estimates of the total amount of transit that's available. So GTFS, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's called the General Transit Feed Specification. This is the database standard that describes transit systems that was developed in Portland, hand in hand with Google in, I think 2006 was when they came up with that. And so if you ever use Google Maps or Google Transit to figure out what the best way is to get from one place to another by transit, underlying that is a database that describes the transit system. So here I have a little example of how to get to Harvard from the north end of Boston. Thanks to GTFS that this exists. So one thing that they asked us to do was to take the route data that we'd put together for the Accra Trotro network and convert that to GTFS, so that it could be used, among other things, in this hackathon that AFD and the Accra Municipal Assembly organized. So they took that GTFS data, they put it into a hackathon, and Nathaniel, I'm sure if he's here, I don't know, maybe, oh yeah, he is here. So he's probably, I was gonna say turning in his grave, but he's not dead, but he's probably, maybe he's gritting his teeth. But all the same, there was a hackathon with this data that had been converted to GTFS. There's 40 participants and 15 teams. A number of different interesting apps, or at least prototypes came out of it. They're typical multimodal trip planning smartphone apps. There's also an app called Magic Route, which wasn't smartphone based, or wasn't designed exclusively for use with smartphones. It was an SMS based system, so it's something that would be for which people would more likely have phones in Accra, and then a social media type, this thing called Woolay. It was a social media journey planner, so that as you're on the bus, if you see something funny, you can take a picture of it and tell it to your other friends who are on the Trotro network. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like social network stuff, but I think it probably has potential. So one of the things that we were also able to do, because we had this GTFS data, we were able to convert it into a user-friendly, a human-readable map, I call it. So here's our original map that I showed you before, which is detailed and complicated, useful for planners and authorities, but difficult to use for actual Trotro users. So with the GTFS data, some analysis with Postgres and PostGIS and QGIS, and importantly, a fine arts student, we made this into a human-readable map, or what we think is a human-readable map, that looks something more like you might see in a typical, an actual transit map that people might use. So that was one part of this phase 2 of our project. Another application of this data, or of this mapping, is to the question of route variation. So in phase 1, that initial map that I showed you, it provided a snapshot of the Trotro system. Yes, 5 minutes. Great, I think I'm right on time. There's a snapshot of the Trotro system, but a critical question for the users is whether the routes always take the same roads, whether they always take the same amount of time. And a goal of phase 2 was to understand that, so we've taken an approach, or they've designed the approach in Accra to start where we work from a terminal, and then we watch the routes that leave a substation of these terminals. And so we learn a number of different things. First of all, we get a sense of the routes that are coming and going, or the Trotros that are coming and going, as well as the degree to which there's variation in the routes. And you can see that for the most part, it's not too bad. The routes, when you run them 2 or 3 times, the actual itineraries are quite similar, but sometimes you get quite big differences. Up at the top, leaving from Kaneshi and going to Korle-Bu Hospital, for example, there's a very big divergence in the 2 itineraries in the 2 routes that we have. So that's obviously important for the planners, thinking about how to formalize the system. But also in the context of, one thing that's interesting about them is that they are quite flexible and they can change quite quickly, which in some ways has advantages, but in other ways has disadvantages. Another question is just how many Trotros are out there. We know how many routes there are, but how many Trotros are there out there? How often do they go out? And so that's we're trying to get an estimate or a sense of total transit supply. Like I mentioned before, the system is organized around these terminals. The terminals are divided into substations. So you see these there's each of these different little concrete, I wouldn't say huts, but kind of like Ks. Those are the different substations. And from those substations, there are normally around 6 routes and 50 Trotros. So by looking at these boards here, this is where it becomes a little bit less digital. These boards are a record of the Trotros that have gone on the different routes. And so a combination of information of what the routes look like, as well as the number, the Trotros themselves as they are assigned to the different routes over the course of the day, provides us with a sense or with an estimate of total transit supply. So that's the long and the short of it. I just wanted to show you how we've been using these smartphone applications to do dynamic mapping in the context of a secondary city, and the various applications for which the data that's been collected is being used in an actual planning situation. And so that's it. There's all my sponsors. And I can take any questions.
Hi, as far as managing like the accuracy of the GPS versus battery burn rate on the mobile devices, were you guys using very accurate GPS? Were you pulling the GPS, or what was the granularity used for that?
Yeah, so we had to tweak the application a little bit, because the way it runs ordinarily is to stop recording when the phone's not moving, and that's to help reduce battery usage. So at that time, with that version, it would pull every 60 seconds. And so that was the granularity that we got. We had battery packs as well that we provided all the surveyors, and that was sufficient to keep the phones running and collecting data for the whole day.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I have 2 questions. One has to do with the Trip Lab and the fact that the information is going back to the Trip Lab, and I'm guessing that's in Montreal at your university, and I was curious if you were going to be trying to, I guess, collect the data and analyze it there in situ and at the site in Accra.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. My second question is a little different. Has to do. I was just curious if you found that the transportation extended past the city. Is that one of your findings? Are they looking into extending that transportation into maybe satellite cities and towns? So, thank you. So
the first question related to the data and analysis in situ. So that data, the GTFS data, is open data. It's now public, so anyone can analyze it anywhere they want. And that was at the request of the Accra Municipal Assembly. We are doing some analysis internally, and we're helping them with the analysis. That's part of our role in the project. So analyzing amount of overlap in itineraries and a number of different ways of try to analyze the data. So it could be done in situ at the moment. There is some analysis that has been done in situ with the Accra Municipal Assembly. So first of all, there's that layer of the person who is running the surveys and organizing the surveyors. He was intimately involved in making sure that the data was being collected, that it made sense compared with, so the local knowledge, domain-specific knowledge, and also he's done some analysis. So there's analysis done on both sides, but the actual mapping we did. The second question about whether it extends outside the city, I didn't go into detail about that, but there was one of so the project itself was scoped to a certain extent to include only routes that begin and end within the Accra Municipal Assembly. So that limits the number of routes that are there. GAPT, one of the other sponsor organizations, they're responsible for many different municipalities, and each of those municipalities have different ways in which they organize the routes themselves. So it's those routes already exist. And then, of course, there are completely informal routes that exist that are outside of the law and outside of the regulation of the AMA, and those we don't capture at all. And it's difficult to get a sense of how many routes that represents.
I've got the mic. Sorry. Hey. I was surprised and heartened to hear that you hired a visual artist.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Like why you did that? What was interesting about it? It's just not something that you see a lot of, and I'm just be curious to hear about how that worked and how you found them and how you involved that person in the project.
Yeah. Well, it's very important in, it sounds like a lot of the audience is pretty academic, and just not everyone's an academic, but in the academic community, there is certainly importance given to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And it's often talked about, difficult to define, but to me is like pornography in the sense that it's difficult to describe, but it's quite easy to identify when you see it. And that's how I feel about this particular interaction with the fine arts department. So I have a colleague in fine arts. I knew, so my former student who was working for the French Development Agency, he was a planner at Sciences Po, which is one of they call it one of the grandes écoles in France. And he was in planning, but he had a lot of interaction with architects and designers. And he said, for this kind of map, I think it would be a good idea to try to find someone in fine arts. So I contacted a colleague of mine. And Concordia has a very good fine arts, finance too, I think, but fine arts department. And it turns out that the best undergraduate student in that program was also a hobbyist of maps as one of his favorite things, one of his hobby kind of design things. So he got in contact with me, and it worked very well. But it was extraordinary. Why it was this, to me, an eye-opening interdisciplinary experience was that the first day he came to present me with something. He had done research, and it's not the kind of thing that I would have thought of as research at all. But he'd come up with different methods of presenting the information, including typographies. So different types of typography to display the map information on it that I just never would have thought to devote that much time to, but that made an enormous difference. And you can see the difference between the two maps. There's one which is really like an engineer's map or a geographer's map that they could understand, but for regular people it's very complicated to get. And so it was a process of his gaze on the problem, and with his help simplifying the information that was there. Basically, the map that he worked on, this final fine arts map, was it just contained the information of the sequence of the terminals that the Trotros went to. And so that's how it happened.
I had one question and then one asking your opinion about something. The question is, did you find out what the average Trotro fare was in the investigation? I'm just kind of curious, is it really affordable for them, or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is, and it's designed to be that way. We do have averages. Did I present them here?
Oh, I see it.
So, yeah, so So the mean is 1.67 cedis. I don't know if that means very much to you. It doesn't. I think it's about 30 cents.
And then the other question is I was just reflecting on the phenomenon of Uber as being like a huge disruptor in the transportation. It's really driven by incredibly powerful mapping system, like right in your back pocket. And do you have any thoughts about that as a transportation and mapping person, about how that's sort of like, is that changing the whole game?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a disruptive. I mean I'm not sure if you can call Uber a disruptive technology. It's like a disruptive intervention, presentation of a series of different technologies. I mean I don't know what it's like here in the States. In Canada, it's sort of a 4-letter word, Uber, and it actually is a 4-letter word. And so I've taken Uber. I don't know whether people here have or not. But the first time I did was this winter, and my daughter, I had to bring her to the hospital, and there was a snowstorm, and there was no taxis. I called the taxi company. There were no taxis, so I called Uber. And once I experienced that, I thought, oh yeah, the taxi industry as we know it is really is going to have to change. And
Map kind of drives it, because you can see.
yeah, well, I mean that's an important aspect of it. This, the knowledge of how far the thing is away from you. I think is one aspect of it that makes it really a lot more appealing than a regular cab, where you think to yourself, is it coming? Yeah. I call back. Look, I called 10 minutes ago. He said it was going to be 5. Yeah, it's 5 minutes. And with Uber, you know that it's just around the block, or it'll be there in 2 minutes. But yeah.
One more question.
Your graphic designer, by the way, created something called a Beck map. It was invented by Harry Beck in 1923 for
Oh my goodness!
for the London Underground. And I teach a whole class on it. But
You do.
that's not merely my question.
Well, that was part of the research.
Okay,
Part of
good.
the
You read
research.
the right literature.
Yeah.
I wonder if you know of John Weeks and Doug Stowe at San Diego State University, who've been mapping Accra for about 10 years with remote sensing
No, I have
census data.
No.
I suggest you contact them.
Okay. Why, is there something wrong there?
No, not at all. But I see scope for data fusion.
Oh, I see. Right. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're about 15 minutes behind schedule, and we've got a short coffee break planned, and then we'd like to come back here. And this is a really exciting part of the program. We really want to have this next panel discussion be very interactive. We are going to have the people who just presented be down here and have some guiding questions for them, but we really want participation from you as the audience. And so when you come back, I'm going to ask you all to come close, sit down here, not way in the back. That allows for more interactive communication, and we'll have a nice discussion about some of the lessons we've learned in the past few hours, some of the steps forward we might see, possibilities for talking about collaboration, and some of these types of things. So please take your coffee break and then come back.